Are we back?
Welcome, and thank you so much for joining the Santa Fe Center for Contemporary Art program. I'm Dan Monroe, retired Rosemarie and Ike Van Otterloo Director and CEO of the Peabody Essex Museum, past chair of the American Alliance of Museums, and past president of the Association of Art Museum Directors. I'm delighted to be here with two very, very distinguished colleagues. Kaywin Feldman, who is director of the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., past chair of the American Alliance of Museums, and past president of the Association of Art Museum Directors, and Matthew Teitelbaum, the Anna Graham Gunn director and CEO of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts and past president of the Association of Art Museum Directors. We are going to discuss today the impact of COVID-19 on museums, both near-term and long-term potential impacts. We encourage you to submit questions, which we'll take by means of chat toward the end of this session. And again, I want to thank all of you for attending. We have people from not only around New Mexico and the West, but around the nation. And very, very special thanks to Kaywin and Matthew for taking time to do this with us today. Let's begin. And Kaywin, can you just tell us very briefly what the impact of COVID has been on to date on the National Gallery?
Sure, thank you, Dan, and thank you so much for inviting me today. Like most museums in America, we closed on March the 13th to the general public and sent our staff home. We have about 1,200 employees at the National Gallery, and we've all been at home, and I'd say about half of our staff is able to telework pretty effectively from home. The other half not as well, so they're spending a lot more time on webinars and other sorts of development opportunities. We've been able to keep everybody on the payroll, so no layoffs or furloughs, which I'm very grateful for. Like all museums, our exhibition schedule has become complete chaos, and it's been really affirming, I think, for all of us, as I'm sure Matthew would agree, that museums all over the world have this chaos in their exhibition schedule, and we're all understanding and trying to help each other out by extending exhibitions, which we had in the building. For example, the National Gallery, we had just opened a major exhibition about Degas at the Opera, and we'll be able to extend that once we do reopen. And you know, one of the real unknowns is if there's another wave in the fall, what's going to happen to our exhibition schedules at that point. So, but for right now, I think we all sort of have it all sorted out. And I spend most of my time communicating. So I'm trying to stay in touch with all of our staff working remotely, trying to keep people close to our mission, doing lots of messages and all staff meetings, and staying in touch with our board and patrons. And the last thing I'll say that I think does make the National Gallery different from most other museums in America is that we're a federal institution. And so our decisions in closing down, in teleworking with employees, and also reopening, we look at what the mayor of Washington, D.C. is saying for reopening. We look at what the governors of Maryland and Virginia are saying. And then we also abide by any directives from the federal government, from OPM and OMB, Congress. So it's a complicated mix there to sort of figure out. So I think that's one thing that makes us a bit different.
Matthew, tell us about the impact on the MFA today.
Well, we're engaged in a very intense process of rethinking our institution for the future. And we're looking at it in three segments, which is financial, structure, and culture. And I would say that the impact of COVID has been deep on all three. We receive about 0.01% of our budget from government. I'm just saying that to get Kaywin's attention. The rest is either our endowment or earned income or philanthropy. All three of those registers have been affected by COVID, so we're dealing with a substantially reduced revenue stream going forward. We realize as a result we have to rethink the structure of our organization, which we are in the midst of doing. That has implications for staff, for program, and for the range of ways in which we serve our communities. And then there's culture, which is to say, we have to be aware as museum leaders that we are dealing in a generalized moment of uncertainty, but a very specific moment of uncertainty for our staff and those people who support us. And part of my work, Kaywin says, in touch with staff, engaged with keeping people close to the mission, and also reimagining what culture will mean in a reduced institution, doing fewer things. How do we maintain a focus on the things which are most important? So financial, structural, and cultural, COVID has affected all of them. It happened very quickly. Kaywin and I have spoken of this before. You know, nothing in museum director school got us ready for this. We're staying pretty close to each other as a community. And I would say, just to end on a sort of taking the volume up and the lightness of tone up, there are wonderful things that are happening about generosity, reciprocity, connection that we have to remember, both within our communities and within our institutions, that we must place in the middle of our institutions going forward.
Thank you, Matthew. A little technical issue here, as we expected. Obviously, both of you are getting ready to reopen, and if you would, could you run through some of the considerations that you're giving to reopening, and what kind of effects do you think reopening will have on your institutions as well as on museums nationwide? Matthew, do you want to lead off?
Well, you know, I've got to say this with absolute clarity. We have no expectation of when we're opening. We're planning certain things. We're planning July, August, September. If any of you had the misfortune of being in a museum director conversation, which we have pretty regularly now, we all say things with certainty, and then the next week we say, oh, by the way, that doesn't hold anymore, because we're all navigating different inputs and different points of view and different facts on a daily basis. Do I think we're going to open in the summer? Maybe. Do I think we're going to open in the fall? Almost certainly. A colleague of Kaywin's, Lonnie Bunch, the Secretary of the Smithsonian, has a phrase about it not being an on-off switch, it being a dimmer. I like that very much. I do think it's a matter of degrees, even when the people we work with want certainty from us. So Dan, you want certainty from me. You want me to say, this is what we're doing for the opening, here's our checklist.
No, not me.
this, and you're not going to get it. You're not going to get it. No. But what you are going to get is a conviction that if we don't get the safety of our staff and the safety of our public right, no matter what our program is and no matter what structure we put in place to meet the future, it won't work. So I think that this is what's new, certainly for me, and I'm sure for Kaywin. We're not used to spending the time we have been spending in understanding how the physical space of our museums allow people to gather with confidence, allow people to gather with a sense of safety. And the very first step that we're all learning together, and we're benefiting from some institutions that have opened, is that question of how do you bring people into your space with safety and security. And there is a list of things that we're doing. There are things we have to get right. It goes all the way from from the equipment that we have, the way in which we take care of our spaces, our HVAC systems, our ability to keep people physically distanced. I mean, those are all things we're working through. And by the way, again, Kayvin alluded to this, we're sharing stuff easily and comfortably, and we're learning a lot from each other. The reopening schedule for all of us is, and I've been very struck by this, is powered by two things. One, putting our staff in a place where they can make and feel that they are making a contribution to their communities, bring as many of them back into the workforce and into the museum as we can, bring as many into the active service as we can. And secondly, the thing that motivates us as we're thinking about the opening, and I know we feel this, is the importance of our institutions in our communities. There isn't a day that passes that I don't hear from a number of people saying to me how important the museum is in their sense of their world, their sense of their community, their sense of connecting with others. And that's motivating us. The way we're going to open and what we have to do to get there is a bit of a playbook, and we're building it out together as we learn new things. But I'm going to say to you, Dan, we still don't know the date we're going to open.
Yeah, understood. That makes perfect sense. That setting a hard and fast date and having all of this solved is not going to be easy. Kayvin?
Yeah, I often reflect on the sort of the month from about February the 24th, when it started to hit me that we were going to be impacted by COVID-19, and how naive I was every single day, and actually even vividly remember the day we decided to close, seeing that the MFA had put on their website that they were closing for a month. And I went into somebody's office with my eyes as big as cow eyes and said, MFA is closing for a month. It just seemed inconceivable to me. And boy, how naive I was on that day. Just sort of every day, I'm struck by that. The only thing I did get right was I said from the beginning it was going to be a lot harder to reopen the National Gallery than to close it. And we're actually pretty good at opening and closing the National Gallery. We've had a lot of government shutdowns over the years, and the gallery does know how to react. The difference, though, of course, is with a government shutdown, there's a day that we open and we just reopen and everybody's back and everything is back exactly as it was. And so that's what's different here. And like Matthew, we're putting the safety of our staff and our volunteers and our visitors first and foremost. So that is our greatest priority in our planning. And we've created a sort of a plan of 5 different phases, if you will. I always like alliteration, so I call it the 5 R's. The first phase is remote, and that's what we're all doing now, continuing to work and working remotely from home and thinking about how we advance our strategy and our goals that way. Our next phase we're thinking about is return, and that's when we start to bring staff back, but recognizing, I think like all institutions, and certainly museums, that there isn't going to be one day when everybody's just back in the building. We're going to continue to encourage as much teleworking as possible, and have to think about the number of people per floor and what that means for elevators and all of our spaces. And so kind of phased return. The next phase is the reopening phase, so when we open to the public. And again, we're thinking about a phase there. So probably we hope that in the middle of June, we will be able to reopen our fantastic sculpture garden. And for obvious reasons, it's sort of easier to manage people and maintain safe distancing outside, and be able to sort of, celebrate and welcome people back. And then perhaps in early July, if possible, we'll start to open parts of our main campus, so the West Building and then the East Building. And then the next phase that we're thinking a lot about is the period between when we sort of start to reopen and when there's a vaccine. And I call that recovery. And I think we're all recognizing that that's actually going to be quite a long phase, and it's not necessarily going to be the new normal, but it's a path to the new normal. and looking at some of the work we want to do during that phase, so that when we do reach that new normal, we're ready to really just sort of hit the ground with our new strategy and some of the things that we were planning to do pre-COVID. So that's how we're thinking about things, saying that sort of 5-phase approach. And the last thing I'll say is that we are all just trying to learn as quickly as possible, since this is new to all of us, whether it's through different webinars and the great work we're able to do as a museum community. As Matthew can attest, our colleague Gary Tinterow at the Houston MFA opened last week, and
Right.
we've all been listening to him and hearing from him his thoughts and advice. So just trying to learn as quickly as possible in this new scenario.
One of the major challenges that's going to come out of this and is already emerging is the fact that the financial underpinnings for American museums have not been exceedingly strong in many ways. Even prior to COVID, the American Alliance of Museums put out some information a while back saying that about 1/3 of American museums are running on a very thin edge financially before COVID. Clearly, all museums that have admission fees have been severely affected by the closures. And on top of that, we have, of course, the fact that COVID has restructured markets and affected people's personal financial status, so that clearly there's likely going to be some impact in terms of contributed support for museums. So the question is, what are your thoughts about potential impacts of all of this in terms of the financial standing of museums in this country, certainly including art museums, but all museums? Matthew?
Again, you're talking about two institutions, Boston Museum of Fine Art and the National Gallery, which are different in that
Very different.
the way in which their revenues come. That said, I don't think K-Win's without concern about what government support will be in the longer term. But here's the more general thing. So do I think that institutions are going to have to think about their structures differently because in one way or another their support is going to be less? Yes, I do. Do I think that museums, by and large, are going to have to do fewer things? Yes, I do. Do I think that museums are going to have to do different things, not just fewer things? Yes, I do. And I think international travel and the whole way in which we exchange works of art is, at least in the short to medium term, going to change. So I think there are going to be changes that are thrust at us. I'm going to say this: they're not all bad. They're not all bad. The notion of thinking of your structure in relation to what your audiences want, and I think the three of us deeply believe museums exist to create and serve audiences. To be actually closer to that and to really ask ourselves the question, is the structure of our institution and the scale of our institution necessary to serve the audience as best they can? And by the way, are our resources prioritized in the best way that they could be? I, for one, in some ways, I'm embracing this notion of thoughtful restructuring. When I say that, there's a huge asterisk, and I pause for effect. The human toll is gruesome. It's really tough. You work beside people, you care about people, you create a culture, and that is going to change. That by any definition, a smaller institution is going to mean that the number of staff positions is also going to decrease. That is really tough. But if I step out of that and think, okay, future of museums, there's something that's going to come out of this that is going to be highly sustainable. It's going to be partly what K-Win was saying before. We're talking to each other and being far more generous and reciprocal. Let me be clear, not K-Win and me. The two of us have always been generous and reciprocal. I'm saying as a profession, right? As a profession, we have some work to do, and this moment is encouraging us. You know, I was thinking the other day, we're actually only competitive, and we are only not reciprocal when we're certain about something, because then we're just going to hold on to it, because you know what, we actually have the magic potion. But we're in a moment now where we actually don't know, so we're reaching out naturally. You know what, that's a very positive thing. That is something that we need to hold on to, and I'm very focused on how we're going to continue to integrate our learnings into our new MFA, because many of them are really wonderful.
That's great. Kaylin.
Yeah, I think that, of course, the most frightening part about this is what we don't know. And I watch a lot of our colleagues are all understandably working towards managing a deficit to an end of the fiscal year. And so many of our colleagues have a year end of June 30. And so there's understandably a great focus on getting to June 30. But of course, what we don't know is what's going to happen to the economy over the next year or so, and what that impact will be. When you look at the 2008 crash, which hit us all very, very hard, you know, eventually museums did bounce back. We lost a few institutions along the way, and our field shrunk for a while, but we did manage through it. Here, we don't know what the longer term impact is going to be. And it is a time, I think, to reflect on how undercapitalized our institutions are, and that we have a model that's exclusively about growth. And throughout my career, I have always been a part, myself included, with our staff and our board that just says growth is the goal. We want more and more art. We have to acquire more collections. We need more galleries to accommodate that. We want more people. We need more endowment. But the revenue streams never keep up with the pace of the growth. And I do think that it's a time for kind of rethinking how we measure ourselves, what is success, perhaps making a greater impact on individuals will be more important than growing in some ways, which is another way of stating sort of what Matthew was saying about really looking again at what some of our structures, our goals, our values are.
You know, there were a number of trend lines before COVID-19 that were, at least from my perspective, an increasing concern. Between 2002 and 2015, art museum attendance decreased by 20%. Between 2016 and 2019, the 35 top art museums in the country regained some of that loss. But overall, if you look at the statistics for attendance versus population growth, we were in a position of concern from a demographic and a variety of other standpoints in terms of the trend lines before COVID-19. So one of the points that you just made, Matthew, was the fact that while painful, the fact is that crises often generate a lot of innovation and creativity. And that, in fact, I would agree with you, Matthew, may be a good thing, and I think probably will be, even though it's going to be very, very tough. The kinds of things that might be involved in that innovation and creativity, I'd like to talk about just a second, with a little bit more detail. So, Matthew, what kinds of things are you thinking about with respect to creating that much stronger connection, perhaps, to audiences, to rethinking the structure of what we do and the priorities within the field as a whole, as well as within, of course, our individual institutions? What are your thoughts on
that? Let me start by saying, to make sure I say it with emphasis, the human toll, the consequence of this economic and shifting moment is very challenging. And, you know, I wouldn't want you or Kaywin to think that when I say certain things about the opportunity before us, that I say it neutrally. You know, I am focused on sustainability of institutions and specifically the Boston MFA. I'm prepared to do the things that I need to create a sustainable future that includes growth. But I'm never far away at all from the challenging things that have to happen for that change to take place. I just want to say that because there isn't a day that I don't really start my day by thinking about staff and that structure.
Right.
I think there are a few things. I think the big issue for art museums, which is coming out of this moment, is the content generation online and on site, and how we understand the balance. And I have colleagues who are setting, I think, unnecessary binaries of choice between the two. I'm going to hold on to the in-museum experience at all costs. I'm going to move most of my assets to online. I think it's about the reciprocity of the two. And I think it's both about the development of content and then the potential monetizing of content. And I think that all of us need to be in that space. I don't have the answer. I'm just telling you that as I think about the new structure of the MFA, I know that I'm going to put resources on to figure that out, because I do think that is key to the future of museums. That's number one. Number two, I think generally as a financial model that follows a certain set of values, I'm looking at new ways of sharing and of working in partnership. I've always thought this was a goal. A large institution like the MFA had to serve by creating relationships of sharing. I think that's even more a business imperative than it's ever been, because there is such duplication of resources in regional museums that are close to one another, that if we don't figure this out, we will find that we can't sustain particularly smaller institutions. And then the last thing I would say is something that I've been committed to, you know, all my career, and I think it's going to be more important as a way of developing audiences, which are going to be so key to our economic resetting, is the notion of, is the question of voice. How do you invite people into your museum? And one of the reasons why the three of us get along is because in our own way we've done that. You know, Dan, what you did at Peabody Essex very much was about how do you create the point of view that your visitor can engage with. And Kaywin did very specific things about bringing the voice of the community in an authentic and deep way. And I think that that change is not just I'm going to say it, it's not just a feel-good change. It is a business necessity to build the audience who actually care about your institution. And you know, our economic recovery at the MFA will depend in part on our ability to bring people back in the building. It has to do with safety, but it also has to do with creating experiences in which the visitor feels implicated, engaged, a co-creator, however you want to talk about that. And I believe that's a business imperative, and I think this moment reminds us of that. So, you know, I'm saying three things: the digital, number one, the sharing of resources, number two, and the notion of the invitation to voice, number three. And I think they're all both values driven, but they're also business strategies.
Great, great, thank you. Kaywin.
Thank you, Matthew. I always take notes whenever Matthew talks. He's always so smart. So we started a team at the gallery called the Lessons Learned Initiative. And I said that I wanted to be a learning institution, and that there's so much that we can learn through this moment and learn about ourselves, as well as how we handle the crisis, and if we have to close again, what we might need to know. And I actually thought about when I ran a museum in Memphis, Tennessee. We had a horrible, unexpected windstorm one day. We had 100-mile-an-hour winds that suddenly hit the city, and like half the trees in Memphis were down. And at the museum, we were without power for 9 days, and we were without power or phone for 3 weeks at home. And I'd go into the museum, and our Coke machine was plugged into the emergency generator. So we had cold Cokes for 9 days. My colleagues from other institutions would come over to get a cold Coke, and we just loved the cold Cokes. It wasn't until after the whole thing ended that it occurred to me we could have unplugged the Coke machine and plugged the phone system into that jack and actually had telephone calls. So, so this sort of lessons learned is both practical as well as philosophical. And you know, a few things that we've realized, and one I'm really delighted about is that the staff is really now demanding that we become a more sustainable institution. And I do sort of smile about it because I think I'd been the director of the National Gallery for 2 weeks when I realized that my primary responsibility is to sign papers. And I get these stacks of papers every day on my desk. And usually the top sheet has a little piece of paper wrapped around it and a little paper clip. And there's often 8 colored sheets below it of all the different people who have seen it, signed off on it, initialed it before I get that top copy. And guess what? We're managing to do it all digitally right now. So there's a great cry for us to step up and really embrace the responsibility of being a sustainable institution. We're also really working to be agile. And, you know, as a government institution, agility has not always been our #1 goal. And, but certainly something that the staff was eager to step into. And I often think about, they had a 1.5 day notice that we were going to close. And our team just rushed around the building, capturing video in the galleries, doing digital tours. I kept passing curators, running back and forth under the concourse over to the West Building to film interviews in front of different paintings. And then they've been creative ever since. So we're really focused on remaining an agile institution. Ironically, I've also heard a lot more about collaboration during this time. We, of course, do spend a lot of time on Zoom calls, but I'm hearing from the staff they're working together in new ways that they never thought possible before. And I think because everybody's going through something simultaneously, there's a real empathy and a sense of connection that people are valuing. I think the last thing I'd emphasize is sort of the obvious one of digital. And, you know, as we all know, museums, as they have embraced digital, it's always been, at first it was something we had to do. We knew we had to have a website because that's what everybody told us we had to have. And we saw digital sort of the other thing, the icing you did on top of the real work. The cake was the building and the collections and what was happening inside. And I think what we've learned from this is that the digital is going to be an equal platform for us. It doesn't replace the in-person experience. None of us think that. And they're 2 totally different kinds of things. But what's changed is that we recognize that digital is absolutely just as important and relevant. And I think we'll see some exciting new, a new era for museums and digital content.
Thank you, Kay. Well, I think one of the things that'll be interesting to watch as we see this evolution take place in terms of seeking sustainability and trying to connect with not just our immediate past audiences, but with new audiences, is a much greater focus, and you mentioned this, Matthew, on thinking about what it means to, for example, engage people in the art museum experience. And one of the things that was an outcome of the neuroscience initiative that we launched at PAM, which is focused on the idea that if we better understood how our brains work, we could create perhaps much more compelling kinds of art experiences, was a question pertaining to what it means to actually engage people. And while we talk about it often, the question really stands, what's that mean? And fortunately, we had a team, a group of advisors who were distinguished neuroscientists, one of whom had access to a tremendous amount of data that was relevant to this question, and the outcome, and was able to, in a way, answer the question. The outcome was that in order to create engagement, you have to create attention, you have to command people's attention. But the next part of this was really quite interesting from the standpoint of the kinds of experiences we create at art museums, and it was that you have to command people's attention in ways that generate emotion. And emotion is not something that has been first and foremost in the ways in which we've thought traditionally about interpreting and presenting art. And if you think about how we would do things differently if we were really trying to structure experiences of art that were designed to generate emotion, because it's such a core part of what art is, it turns out it would have quite a substantial impact. So there may be things like this that change the ways in which we begin to think about how we create and structure experiences of art. I want to talk just for a second and go back to the issue of collaboration, because it's a really interesting point. The collaboration that usually happened prior to COVID has to do with institutions coming together to cooperate and collaborate because there was some compelling reason for them to do so, and both jointly to do so. Now there are compelling reasons, I would suspect, and I'm sure, that go beyond what we had in the past. So I'd like to just touch on that a little bit more and hear what your thoughts are about what kinds of collaborations do you see happening that would be different than what we traditionally have done in the past. Kaywin, do you want to lead off?
Yeah, I don't know that I actually have a very specific answer, because I do think it's going to be different. And in the past, we all enjoy working with our colleagues so much, and we've done it so profoundly through exhibitions. That's been one of our primary vehicles for collaboration. And I do believe that exhibitions will continue, and that will continue to be a way, but not for a while, and maybe not for the scale that we've seen for a while. And Matthew and I actually have been on calls with some of our international colleagues, and there's a real hunger that we remain joined as an international organization, even if our main mission had been purely exhibition exchange, and now thinking about other ways. And again, the sort of digital enables us to have new kinds of meetings and conversations that we weren't having before, when getting together meant getting your team on an airplane and flying to Boston to meet with the folks at the MFA. And now we can be a little more agile and a little more creative about getting together to share thoughts and ideas and think about resources in some new ways.
Matthew, thank you.
Am I on? Yeah. I've been thinking about the virus, and I've been thinking about the virus as something that we can't see, and yet it connects us all. And I've been thinking about how that challenges the notion of exceptionalism. And by the way, I think America's in a moment when that notion of America as exceptionalism is also being questioned, but it's certainly true in the museum world, right? One of the reasons why we're collaborating is because it turns out the Metropolitan, the MoMA, the National Gallery in Washington, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, as well as the museums in small communities are all dealing with the same issue. There's no such thing as an exceptional museum that can escape something. Now, before, there were lots of ways in which the larger institutions could escape something and they had the money to get. Now we're all dealing with the same issues, and by the way, the same inability to be certain of the outcome. So the reason why I say that in relation to collaboration is because I think once you accept that there isn't the exceptionalism and the notion that we are different, we don't have to ... Then you get to, well, we do have to reach out think about how to do things with each other, find more ways to connect. And I think there are two reasons for this. One is resources. I just think that it is, if you were still at the Peabody Essex stand, we would be having very intense conversations about resource sharing, because there were things that we did, and our overlap was relatively short, that if we had had a long runway together, we would have just approached differently. We just would have. Our logic would have brought us there. And I think this moment is now going to bring that logic of collaboration from a resource point of view really into focus. And then the second thing about collaboration is if we can get it right, we know that we need to work with each other to build audience. So when I think of collaboration, I don't think just of working with another institution. I'm also saying, how can a large institution like the MFA work within its community, with a community-based organization in which there is reciprocity, and we get the advocacy of those groups in relation to the audience of the MFA. That's exciting. And I think that this moment is going to force us in that direction, simply because it's the practical thing to do. If we can sustain it, then the question is, can we sustain it? And we're all thinking a lot about that. I think we're all thinking about that. And I think that, Kaywin, I suspect that, well, I know the values you're bringing to the National Gallery, and I know that you want it to be a truly integrated institution with all of America and the world, but all of America. But I'm sure that you're thinking about the cultural shift that's necessary, how quickly you can make it, how clear you can do it, and collaboration and this giving up of authority and working differently is got to be part of what you're thinking about as well, partly because, I'm not taking Dan's place and asking you a question, Kaywin, but partly because you must be thinking about this notion that the National Gallery isn't as exceptional as everyone said it was, because we're all in this boat together. You know what I mean? Like, we're all together. Anyway, just saying.
I take exception to your indication that we're not exceptional.
Right. Well said.
Let's thank you both so much for all of those thoughts. Let's shift gears and as we have the last 10 minutes, wind up and answer some questions that have been coming in. Let me start with this one. The question is, how has the shift to social media for programming been positive or challenging, and has attendance been similar or increased, I think, relative to, for example, being open and running normally? What's your answer to that, Matthew?
Well, first of all, our online attendance has gone way up, way up.
Right.
Number two, it is on a more consistent basis, put our content creators and providers in the public eye. So our curators, our interpretive planners have a much higher profile than they did when we were dealing just with the museum space as a museum space, and that's been great. And I'd say also, what's been really wonderful is when you do stuff online, you can actually go into your vaults and find stuff that hasn't been up for 20 years. And then you actually discover things and you share them, and people respond. So, and they should, that something like this is in their community. So our curators are truly doing that fantasy thing of walking in the basement and finding the undiscovered masterwork. And that is something. So it's the profile of the creator, it's the and the access to works of art and that dynamic that happens. We have many things that aren't on view, and we get to celebrate them now.
That's fantastic. How about you, Kaywin?
Yeah, I would certainly echo that. I think like all museums, we've seen our traffic to website, participation in social media just go through the roof, and it's been really reaffirming. And it's all arts organizations, I think, are experiencing that, which is absolutely an indication of the great hunger for what we all do. And I think the fact that, at its heart, what we do is reaffirm our shared humanity, and people have been finding that. I do have to put a plug in for following the MFA Boston. I often, I follow all of Matthew's folks on Twitter, and so I'm letting him know what's going on. They have this fabulous dog at the MFA named Riley, who sniffs out pests for the museum. He's a trained working dog. And they posted a photo of him lounging on a chair out in the sun one day. And I was quick to let Matthew know that his staff was goofing off, and there was Riley lounging in the chair. But along the lines of what Matthew's saying, they have a fantastic woman who does all of their provenance research. And she's been posting really fascinating stories about the history of objects in the MFA collections. So, so many ways to dive into museums. At the National Gallery of Art, we have a huge horticulture department because we have our grounds, but any of you who have visited know that we also have these beautiful green areas inside the building where people can just stop and pause and enjoy plants. And we have a historic azalea collection. And we've been able to post information and details and ideas from our horticulture department. So it's just, I think, allowed us to also open the doors even wider, even though we're closed, and show all of the great things that happen inside.
Fantastic. Thank you both. Another question that we'll turn to, and this will be, I think, probably our last one in order to stay on time. And the question is, how do you balance building new audiences with maintaining your current audiences and membership base, which have already demonstrated support for your mission? Matthew.
You know what, Dan? This is in the category of truly unfair, which is, the question is, how would you answer that question? Because, you know, you were a visionary director. You're still a visionary thinker. You're involved in our profession still. You must have moments when you think, boy, if I was still the director at Peabody Essex, I would try this. What would you try in order to balance? What do you think of that, Kevin? That gets us off the hook. But how would you approach that? Because it is a key question. Maybe it's the key question. How do you maintain those who are loyal to you, but how do you build something new at the same time? How are you thinking about that differently?
So I'll answer that question, but you don't get off at the hook. I would think about it this way. I think that if we look at the kinds of trend lines, and I won't go into all of them, but I mentioned some that have to do with attendance and others with what people's expectations are for cultural experiences, which we all are familiar with, the kind of profound changes that have been occurring in that arena over the last few years. I would say that one of the things that's an oddity of our experience as human beings is the fact that we create culture, and it creates tremendous advantages to us in myriad ways, but it also creates huge problems. And while we're the creators of culture collectively, we've never been able to predict where the culture we create will take us. So when we transition, for example, from hunting and gathering to agriculture, no one was sitting around going, gee, is this really such a great idea, this whole agriculture thing? You know, maybe we'd have a lot more disease, and maybe we'd have a lot more warfare, and maybe, you know, population would skyrocket. And all those things, in fact, happened. But at the same time, information increased dramatically, and we generated entirely new technologies and so on. So in the context of COVID, which it layered onto an already changing environment, in my view, culturally, one of the answers to that question that you asked me would be very simple, and that's this. I haven't a clue what all of the answers would be, and I think probably the safest strategy for museums and many other institutions is to take on a much more exaggerated sense of experimentation, commitment to creativity and innovation, trying things with the recognition many aren't going to work, but if you're trying new things all the time, you will eventually begin to connect with the currents that are beginning to shift and change the culture that we've experienced in the past. So that would be, in a simple way, the primary thing I would answer, which is building new audiences is really critical. You have to do that, in my view. But how precisely you do that, given all the changes that are occurring without COVID, but then adding COVID in, I don't know how to predict all of that other than to try a lot of new things. So with that answer, Kay, tell me what your thoughts are.
Well, I think you phrased it very well, Dan. I think, before COVID, that was one of the questions that would keep me up at night. And I would often talk about managing the difference between what I call our loyal traditionalists, who are very important and valued audience for museums,
right.
And this sort of young, very diverse audience of Gen Z and millennials who, now are almost all majority people of color and born digital. And they have different needs and expectations sometimes from our loyal traditionalists. And, trying to balance the two and helping both sort of audiences understand the joys of what it is they both enjoy about the institution is part of the challenge. And, and of course, it all comes down often to money, because you can't afford to do everything for everyone. So you've got to make choices.
Right.
Yeah.
Matthew, you get to wind us up. Now
He always winds me up.
I know you were pretty good, Dan. I was about to jump in and say that's the last word, but then I realized that you're the boss. I think that I often think of Bob Rauschenberg saying that he made what he did in the gap between art and life. And I used to think, what does that mean for me as a museum director? And it means that you somehow make your product in the gap between the front page of the newspaper and the encyclopedia. That somehow you're part of history, but you're part of the moment. And I think if we can stay with that sense of urgency, and I like the way you say it, that notion of creativity, we will be relevant to a lot of people. We all have large enough institutions, even those of us who have 2-room institutions, to have more than one point of view. But we have an obligation that whatever point of view we have, that it be exciting. And I'll end with this thought. I had a visionary trustee who was a mentor of mine when I was a young curator, who was very supportive of our institution when I worked at the ICA in Boston in an earlier incarnation. And I said to her, you're so good to us, what do you want? And she looked at me and she said, just don't be boring. And, in a way, I've never forgotten that. And it's not far off of what we're talking about. Searching for something, trying to find a new way of putting it together, trying to create a new invitation, bringing voice into the institution. I would like people to say of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts the following. I want them to talk about what they didn't see. Not what they came to see, but what they missed, because there's, my God, did you hear they had that? Did you hear that idea? That would have been something I wanted to see. That notion of talking about what's happening in a space beyond that you have to go into, that's pretty exciting. And I think that if we can do that right, with some intentionality about involving the voices of many in our community, we can do both. Reaffirm a traditional position in our communities and open up ourselves to something new. And that's the big pursuit. That is the big pursuit.
I want to thank both of you for your participation in this session and for your incredible leadership at a national and international level in the world art community, and for the tremendous thoughtfulness and care that both of you have always exemplified in the field. All of us believe that art is, and it certainly is the case, central to human experience. Art will always be a core part of what human beings are, and always important. The challenge for us is, to your point, don't make art boring. And the fact is, it's possible to do that, sadly, but COVID, while it creates these incredible challenges, and it's going to be very painful in lots of ways, again, creates some opportunities for us to ramp up our thinking about who we are, what we do, how we do it, and how we make a difference in more people's lives. And I want to thank both of you because you've constantly been doing that in the field. I want to thank all the people in our audience for participating. And on behalf of the Center for Contemporary Art, Maria Gale, all the board and staff, we thank everyone for your participation. We wish you all safety and good health for you and your families. And we'll all move through this together and come out the other side as better human beings. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.